Today, we're diving into the world of a soldier's life during the monumental Napoleonic Wars through the pages of the Diary of a Napoleonic Foot Soldier. This is written by a real foot soldier, Jacob Walter. He is retreating from Moscow and death is always near. Let's get started. In times when death was near, God sent me help again and again. After midnight, when we pitched camp again following the above-mentioned pursuit by the Russians, a little village stood a quarter of an hour off the highway, and I crept with my master and 2 horses into a stable that still had a roof. There I saw, hanging on a cord behind a grate, a smoked pig's head. As if received from the hand of God, I took it off from the cord with a prayer of thanks. I, my master, and my fellow servant ate it with unbelievable appetite, and we felt life come to us again. Then I always thought, if even a few should get to German soil, it is possible that I, with God's help, might also reach there. These days it snowed for the first time, and the snow remained. The cold arrived at the same time too, and the freezing of the people multiplied the number of the dead. No one could walk 50 paces without seeing men stretched out half or completely dead. According to Napoleon's scheme, we were to strike leftward toward Galicia. The Russian, however, hindered us and drove us past Varia and Varina, and to the right into our old desolate highway. Finally, we went over the battlefield at Mojaisk in the Holy Valley. Here one saw again in what numbers the dead lay. From the battle site onto this place, the corpses were dragged from the highways, and entire hollows were filled with them. Gun barrels lay one on top of another in many piles, from 15 to 20 feet in height and in width, where we bivouacked for the night. Here God once more came to my help in a wondrous way. As I sought to fetch water in the night with my field flask, I came to a lake in which a hole had been chopped through the ice, and I drew my water with much effort because of the pressure of those standing around. On the way back, a round ball resembling a dead sheep was lying on the ground. I picked it up, and in astonished joy, unwrapped a rolled-up Crimean fur that reached from my head down to my feet, besides having a peculiar collar which could be clapped over my head. With my eyes turned to heaven, I prayed again to God and gave thanks for the abundant mercy which I had received just when help was obviously most necessary. I hurried to my major and had already put on the fur. He saw me and called out loudly, "Aye, God, what do you have on?" "A fur, Major, that I found just now. Now I've at least a covering." "Oh," he said, "I'll give you my fur. It's also a good one. If we get home, then you can have it back again, or I'll pay you enough for it." Thus I took his fur, which was also beautiful, having a green silk lining so that it could be worn right side out or inside out. The next morning everyone hurried on his flight, and no one wanted to be the last. We now came to Kshatsk, and this town was already in flames. Here again many cannon were thrown into the water and part of them buried. The pressure was so frightful that I and my major lost each other. Now I had the second horse to myself, and we could not find each other again that day, nor even for another 10 days. Thus in the evening I rode away from the army to find in the outlying district some straw for the horse and rye for myself. I was not alone, for over a strip 10 hours wide, soldiers sought provisions because of their hunger, and when there was nothing to be found, they could hunt up cabbage stalks here and there from under the snow, cut off some of the pulp from these, and let the core slowly thaw out in their mouths. Nevertheless, this time I had a second considerable piece of luck. I came to a village not yet burned where there were still sheaves of grain. I laid these before the horse and plucked several heads of grain. I hulled them, laid the kernels mixed with chaff into a hand grinder which had been left in a house, and taking turns with several other soldiers ground some flour. Then we laid the dough, which we rolled into only fist-sized little loaves, on a bed of coals. Although the outside of the loaves burned to charcoal, the bread inside could be eaten. I got as many as 15 such balls. For further supply, whenever I came upon sheaves of grain, I picked the heads, rubbed off the kernels, and ate them from my bread sack during the course of the day. Several times I also found hemp seed, which I likewise ate raw out of my pocket, and cooked hemp seed was a delicacy for me, because the grains burst open and produced an oily sauce. Yet since I could not get salt for cooking, it did not have its full strength. When this good night was half over, I laid 4 sheaves over my saddle and rode to the head of the army as usual. Toward the next night, however, in order to make a fire again, I rode off the highway. Wading in the deep snow was too hard for my horse, so I took a peasant's sled, which had only 2 slabs of bark for boards, put a collar made from a sack around the horse's neck, and tied 2 ropes from there to the sled. As I drove on again the same night, I had to cross a river about 60 feet wide, over which only 4 or 5 poles lay. I therefore knew of no other means than to carry the sled over on the poles and to force the horse to swim across. Accordingly, I carried the emptied sled across successfully, although my feet went knee-deep into the water because the poles sank. I brought the horse, which could swim well, being of a Russian breed, to the sled again and drove on. At this river, I met a man by the name of Wittenhofer from my native village who was already deathly weak. I let him ride. He died after a few days. I continued then this sled riding through the burned cities of Vyazma, Semlevo, and Dorogobush without finding my master. Once, while I was eating some of my aforementioned bread, several Frenchmen saw me. These inhuman men surrounded me with the pretext of buying bread, and when the word bread was mentioned, everyone bolted at me, so that I thought my death was near. But through an extraordinary chance there came along some Germans, whom I now called to my aid. They struck at my horse so that most of the Frenchmen fell back from me and then were entirely beaten off. Among these Germans were 2 sergeants from my regiment. After I was free, they took my bread and walked away. Not they I could see now, but rather their hunger and my bread were both my redeemers and at the same time my robbers. Although I had already given them a loaf, they robbed me. But this, my dear readers, is to be judged otherwise than you think. There are stories in which people have murdered and eaten each other on account of hunger, but certainly this incident was still a long way from murder. Since starvation had risen to a high degree, why could not such a thing happen? And besides that, much of the humanity of man had already vanished because of hunger. Indeed, I even heard at that time that several men had been murdered for the sake of bread. I myself could look cold-bloodedly into the lamenting faces of the wounded, the freezing and the burned, as I shall tell later, and think of other things. We arrived at Smolensk on November 12th, having made, from Moscow to that city, 26 days and nights of travel without pausing a day. If we traveled only 12 hours daily, then we had retreated 312 hours up to Smolensk. When I arrived at Smolensk, it was raining rather heavily, and my sled could be pulled only with great effort. When I came toward the city, the crowd was so dense that for hours I could not penetrate into the column, for the Imperial Guard and the artillery, with the help of the gendarmes, knocked everyone out of the way, right and left. With effort, I finally pressed through, holding my horse by the head, and accompanied by sword blows, I passed over the bridge. In front of the city gate, I and my regiment, now disorganized, moved to the right toward the city wall beside the Dnieper River. Here we settled down and had to camp for 2 days. As had been reported to us beforehand, we were to engage in battle with the enemy here, and also to get bread and flour from the warehouses. Neither of the 2 reports, however, proved to be true. The distress mounted higher and higher, and horses were shot and eaten. Because I could not get even a piece of meat, and my hunger became too violent, I took along the pot I carried, stationed myself beside a horse that was being shot, and caught up the blood from its breast. I set this blood on the fire, let it coagulate, and ate the lumps without salt. While we spent 2 days at Smolensk, the Russians advanced and awaited us at Minsk. Everyone hastily fled. Cannon were thrown into the water. The hospitals were nearly all left to the enemy, and, as was commonly rumored, the hospitals were set on fire and burned with their inmates. This is more credible when one considers the treatment of the captured Russians, for when we were victors over the Russians, whole columns of captives were transported past us, and anyone who stayed behind because of weakness and fell back as far as the rear guard was shot in the neck, so that his brain always crashed down beside him. Thus every 50 to 100 paces I saw another who had been shot with his head still smoking. All this was done to make our passage safe, so that no robber corps could be formed behind us. Very few of the captives, however, were saved from starvation. Now, as the march went on, I had to leave my sled behind and to lay my baggage on the horse, upon which I also mounted often during the day. The cold increased again that same day, and the road became as smooth as a mirror from the rain, so that the horses fell down in great numbers and could not get up again. Since my horse was a native of the country, it had no horseshoes and could always help itself up again when it had fallen. It had even the good custom, whenever we went downhill, of sitting down on its rump, bracing its front feet forward, and sliding into the valley in this fashion without my dismounting. Other German horses, though, had shoes which were ground entirely smooth, and for this reason could not keep themselves from slipping, nor could these irons be torn off, since no one had a tool for that. Until now I had not seen my major again, and believed nothing else than that he must be dead. I always cared for my horse by riding out at night where some village blazed brightly, in order to get some rye sheaves for the horse and rye grains for myself. I often could not get feed for 4 or 5 days, but my horse was indifferent if only from time to time he could get some old straw from the camp or some thatched straw from a burned house, nor could I notice that he was getting thin. If I found some rest at night, I served as a crib for him. I always hung the halter strap on my arm or foot so that I could notice any attempts to take him away. I laid myself squarely before his feet, and when he had something to eat, he ground away with his teeth for a short time. When he had nothing, he sniffed and snorted all over me. Not once did his hoof touch me. At the most, he pressed my fur coat a little. Unless you tied your horse to yourself, the horse was stolen immediately. After leaving Smolensk, we arrived on November 16th, amid 1,000 kinds of danger at Krasnoe, where the Russians received us, having in the meantime circled around to our front. Here the French Guard, with the remaining armed forces that could still be brought together, took its position along the highway and kept up the ring against the enemy as well as possible. Although the enemy had to yield, any movements on our part drew vigorous firing upon us. Unfortunately, all the time the greatest misery fell upon the poor sick, who usually had to be thrown from the wagons just to keep us from losing horses and wagons entirely, and who were left to freeze among the enemies, for whoever remained lying behind could not hope to be rescued. Here I once heard my master speak, rather yell, close in front of me, whereupon I called, "Major, is it you?" He glanced at me and cried out for joy, "Oh God, dear valet, is it you? Oh, now I am glad that I have you again. Oh, I am so happy that you are still alive." I also showed my joy over this reunion, for my master still had his old German chestnut, his horse from home, and his other attendant was also with him with a second horse. Now he asked me whether I still had part of his sugar loaf and coffee. Sadly, I had to say that once when I lay down behind a battlement near a raised village at night, a group of cuirassier guards pressed upon me and tore away from me the sack with the sugar and coffee, and I almost failed to keep my horse. I gave in, therefore, and chose another place to lie down, and in occupying my second spot I found straw lying about, with which my horse could still his hunger. I myself lay down on a spot that was soft and not frozen. Before departing, I thought I would see why it was so soft and warm under me, and I saw a dead man whose unfrozen belly had served as my good bed. And I set out upon my journey again, Major, without being able to meet you again. The Major then said, "That does not matter now. I'm glad that you are here again." General Ney, about whom no one knew anything anymore, was in charge of the rear guard. He fought his way through to us. However, his forces were half gone. The march had to go on, and the striking, clubbing, and skirmishing commenced so frightfully that the cry of murder echoed all about. The Cossacks advanced upon the army from all sides. We came toward Dubrovna, and the throng was so great that those on foot were usually beaten and cudgeled to the right and the left of the roadway at such narrow passages as marshes, rivers, and bridges. Here my major and I were pushed apart and lost each other again. It was not possible to recognize one another except by voice. Everyone was disguised in furs, rags, and pieces of cloth. They wore round hats and peasant caps on their heads, and many had priests' robes from the churches. It was like a world turned upside down. I had had enough of my helmet at the very beginning of the retreat. I put on a round hat, wrapped my head with silk and muslin cloths, and my feet with thick woolen cloth. I had on 2 vests, and over my doublet a thick and large Russian coat, which I had taken from a Russian in exchange for my own at Smolensk on the trip into Russia, and over all this I wore my thick fur. I was so enwrapped that only my eyes had an opening out of which I could breathe. From time to time I had to break off from this opening the ice that would immediately form again from my breath. At night in Dubrovna, when the enemy had given up their maneuvers, everyone settled down in and around the place. Every night the fires for warming could be seen over a region 4 hours long and wide, reddening the sky like red cloth. The burning villages at the side contributed most to this sight, and the shrieking, beating, and lamenting did not stop for a minute. This concludes the 7th part of the story. Thank you very much for listening. What do you think of Walter's adventures? Please subscribe for more episodes and leave a comment.